Dante stood in the quiet darkness of his ancestral home, the mansion that had once been a grand palace of stone and glass, but now was little more than a decaying shell of a past that had long since crumbled into dust. His family had been the oldest, most powerful of the vampire clans, their bloodline stretched across centuries like a vast network of interwoven fangs and claws. But centuries of decadence and luxury had given way to complacency and decay, both within the family and in the world they ruled. The once pristine halls, now covered in a layer of dust, felt suffocating to him. He had wandered through this place for so long, and yet it never felt like home anymore. Not since the curse. Not since the moment his humanity was stripped from him, leaving nothing but a hollow, immortal shell. The air was thick with the scent of old blood and the weight of memories. His reflection in the cracked mirror that hung in the foyer, a pale figure in a black coat, his sharp features carved in stark contrast to the darkness, seemed almost foreign. His once vibrant eyes, now dull and unfeeling, stared back at him with the same detachment he had carried for centuries. A glass of blood-red wine, still warm from its source, sat untouched on a marble table near the entrance. Dante's fingers hovered above it, the dark temptation of his vampire nature tugging at him, pulling him into the darkness he had grown so accustomed to. But the wine meant nothing. Not anymore. "Master!" A voice broke through the silence. Dante turned. The servant, a thin, gaunt vampire with hollow eyes and a quiet, respectful demeanor, stood in the doorway. His presence was a reminder of the broken world Dante now lived in, a world he had created, for better or worse. "What is it?" Dante asked, his voice like the rasp of dry leaves scraping across a cold stone floor. "The council has summoned you," the servant replied, bowing his head. "They wish to speak with you." The mention of the council was enough to stir Dante's blood. The Vampire Council, an ancient and secretive body that governed all of vampire kind, had called him. After years of silence, they sought him out. That could only mean one thing: the prophecy was unfolding, and they knew it. He didn't need to be told what was happening. He had felt it long before the Bloodstone had been unearthed. The magic was dying, the threads of reality fraying. The rift between the mortal and magical worlds was growing, and something, or someone, was going to tear it open completely. "I'll be there," Dante said, turning away from the servant, his voice cold and empty. He didn't wait for a response, for the servant was already gone. Dante took one last look at the mansion before stepping out into the night. The streets of the vampire city stretched before him, alive with shadows. The city was built in layers, the uppermost tier, where the elite of vampire society lived in palatial estates, and the lower levels, where the abandoned, the forsaken, and the lesser vampires resided in squalor. Dante had once ruled from the highest tower, surrounded by power and wealth. Now, he felt like a ghost. As he moved through the darkened streets, the air thick with the scent of blood, his mind wandered back to the early days of his transformation. He had once been human, once a nobleman in a forgotten age, with ambitions and dreams of his own. But those dreams had died with the fangs that had sunk into his throat. He could still remember the night it had happened. He had been young, naive, and arrogantly sure that the world was his to command. He had met a vampire, a woman whose beauty and power had drawn him in like a moth to a flame. She had been everything he had ever desired, powerful, enigmatic, with a presence that made him feel small and yet compelled him to surrender. In the end, she had shown him the truth. She had made him what he was, and he had never been the same since. It had been centuries ago. And yet, sometimes, the taste of blood in his mouth felt as fresh as that night. The echo of his former life still haunted him, his life as a man, full of dreams and desires, now lost forever. The council's chambers were carved into the side of a mountain, hidden deep within a labyrinth of tunnels that twisted and turned beneath the earth. The air was always damp here, the cold stone walls thick with the weight of ancient power. The Vampire Council was an old order, its members bound by oaths and secrets that spanned millennia. Dante entered the chamber silently, his footsteps muffled on the cold stone floor. The council members sat in a circle, their figures cloaked in shadow, their faces hidden from view. But Dante could feel their eyes on him, their power pressing against him like an invisible weight. There was a sense of inevitability in the air, something that made him uncomfortable, though he wouldn't show it. "Dante!" came a voice, deep and resonant, as one of the council members spoke. "You know why we've summoned you?" Dante's eyes narrowed. He didn't need to be told. He had known this moment would come, though he had hoped it would not. The vampire world was changing, and not for the better. Something was coming, something that would change everything. "I do," he said, his voice cold. "But I don't understand why you called for me. I am no longer the ruler I once was. My clan is fractured. The Bloodstone calls to you, not me." A low murmur rippled through the council, and Dante felt the tension in the air. The Bloodstone. It was the catalyst, the spark that had started it all. The ancient artifact was said to possess the power to sever the ties between the mortal and supernatural worlds, to break the laws of nature itself. It had the potential to destroy everything: vampires, witches, mortals. Everything. "We need your help," the voice continued. "The rift is widening. The Bloodstone has been found, and its power grows. You, Dante, are the only one who can stop it." Dante's heart, or what remained of it, skipped a beat. "I?" His voice was incredulous. "You have no idea what you're asking. I can barely keep my own mind intact, let alone save an entire world from destruction. You are bound to the Bloodstone," the voice intoned. "As are we all. Your bloodline, it was the one that first unleashed its power. You are the key, Dante. Whether you wish to be or not." The words hung heavy in the air. Dante closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling slowly. The Bloodstone had always been a part of his curse. It was tied to his transformation, to the night that had destroyed his humanity. "The prophecy," he whispered, "the one that speaks of the rift. It's coming true." "Yes," the voice replied. "And only you can prevent the end." Dante stood there, his mind racing. He had long ago stopped believing in fate. Long ago, he had given up on the idea of redemption, on the hope that one day he might be free of the bloodlust, of the endless nightmare of immortality. But now, standing before the council, he couldn't escape the truth: the Bloodstone was rising again. And if he didn't act, if he didn't stop it, everything he had known, everything he had ever loved, would be destroyed. But could he trust them? Could he trust himself? The answer, he knew, was more complicated than any prophecy or promise of power. He was caught between two worlds, bound by blood and curse, a creature of the night who no longer belonged to either side. And as the council's words echoed in his ears, Dante realized with grim clarity that the only thing he could trust was the cold, inevitable pull of the Bloodstone. The house at the edge of the woods was never a home to Liliana. It was a place of survival, cold, silent, and suffocating. The air always smelled of damp wood and musty books, and the walls were lined with faded tapestries, each one depicting her family's cursed history in shifting, whispered images. Her ancestors, once powerful witches, had fallen into madness long ago, driven by the desire to wield the Bloodstone's dark magic. And the bloodline had never been the same since. She had been just a child when she first understood that magic was not something to be revered, but feared. Her mother, a woman of few words but many secrets, had tried to shelter Liliana from it as best she could. But the Bloodstone's influence could not be easily contained, especially in a home like theirs. The curse that ran through her veins was relentless, constantly threatening to rise up and claim her, just as it had claimed the witches before her. Liliana's mother had been the last in their family to truly fight it, to hold on to some semblance of normalcy before the bloodline was consumed completely. But even she had been forced to succumb to the call of the Bloodstone. Flashback. Liliana had been 8 years old when she first saw her mother lose control. It had started small, a flicker of movement in the corner of her eye, a shadow in the hallway that seemed to move when no one was there. The walls had felt thinner that night, the air heavier with the hum of magic. Liliana's mother had tried to keep her inside, away from the strange happenings that had begun to plague the house. But Liliana was curious, and more than that, she was afraid. She had always felt like something was watching her, something dark, something ancient. That night, as the wind howled through the trees, she found her mother in the attic, her figure shrouded in the eerie light of the full moon. "Mother?" Liliana's voice had barely risen above a whisper. Her mother's eyes had been wild, glowing with an unearthly light. Her once calm demeanor had cracked, and in her hands she held the Bloodstone, the same stone that had haunted their family for generations. "Liliana," her mother had said, her voice unsteady. "You must understand. I tried to protect you. But it's too late now." Before Liliana could ask what she meant, her mother's body had convulsed, her fingers twisting around the stone, and the power that had been dormant for so long surged out of her. Magic, raw and uncontrollable, pulsed through the room, tearing at the walls, sending objects flying. Liliana had tried to reach her, but her mother's eyes had filled with despair. "Run, my darling!" her mother had gasped, her voice breaking. "Run! Or it will take you too!" But it was too late. Her mother had collapsed into a heap on the floor, her skin turning an unnatural shade of gray, her breath shallow. The Bloodstone had pulsed once more, sending a shock of energy through the room, and Liliana had been thrown back against the wall, her body hitting the ground with a sickening thud. When she awoke, everything was quiet. Too quiet. Her mother was gone. The Bloodstone was gone. And Liliana, alone in the attic, had felt a cold emptiness settle deep inside her, something that would never leave. Liliana hadn't spoken of that night to anyone. It was one of many painful memories buried deep beneath her skin, locked away like a secret she would never let slip. Her mother had given her one final warning before she died: never seek the Bloodstone. And yet, that was exactly what Liliana was being forced to do now. The Bloodstone had been passed down through her family like a dark heirloom, each bearer thinking they could wield its power without consequence. But the curse had always been the same: corruption, madness, death. The witches who had touched it, the Thornwells, as they were called, had always believed they could control the dark magic. But the stone had other plans. It fed on their desires, their greed, their hunger for power. And once it had them, it consumed everything, the last to resist. She had managed to escape with Liliana, but not before the Bloodstone left its mark on both of them. Her ancestors had built an empire, or at least tried to, on that very same hunger for control. Magic ran through their veins, passed from mother to daughter, father to son, always binding them to the stone. And with each generation, the Bloodstone's influence had grown stronger, the family's grip on their own humanity weaker. When Liliana's mother had been a child, the stone had claimed her father, Liliana's grandfather. In a single night, he had lost everything: his mind, his soul, and eventually his life. The madness had spread quickly, infecting everyone around him. Her mother had been. And now, Liliana was the last of her bloodline. The Bloodstone's influence had seeped into her from the moment she was born, and no matter how far she ran, no matter how hard she fought to break free, it was always there, like a whisper at the back of her mind. Her childhood had been a quiet one after her mother's death. The Bloodstone had disappeared into the world, hidden from her. But the darkness it left in its wake remained. Liliana had grown up in isolation, driven by a need to never repeat the mistakes of the past, determined to carve a life where the stone had no place. But the truth was inescapable. The Bloodstone was tied to her, she was tied to it. There was no running. Not anymore. She was only 24 now, but she had seen enough loss and destruction in her short life to last several lifetimes. Magic had always been her companion, more a burden than a gift, but it was the curses, the blood-soaked legacies, the shadows of her family, that weighed on her most. She had been left with nothing but a broken home, fragmented memories of her mother's warnings, and a burning question: could she stop it? Could she destroy the Bloodstone before it claimed her too? Standing on the edge of the dark forest now, with the Bloodstone waiting for her, Liliana felt the familiar tug in her chest, the pull of her bloodline, the call of the curse that had been passed down for generations. She wanted to run, to leave, to escape this fate. But the truth was clear now. There was no escaping it. She was bound to it. and the only way out would be through the very thing she had sworn to destroy.